Hi, I'm Mike Olson, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit here about my piece, Implied Movement. It's all electronic piece, analog modular synthesizers almost exclusively, with the inclusion of the vintage Minimalism D, which is not modular. Actually, I think it's the first synthesizer that wasn't modular. Anyway, it's a very analog-centric piece, and that was a limitation that I wanted to have on the piece from the start. This was completed in the winter of 2015 and is one of the projects on the Innova Recordings 6 Projects LP CD. And what can I tell you about it? This has a very retro sound, particularly if you're used to hearing electronic music. This piece sounds old-fashioned, and decidedly so. And I think that's fine. It's just what I felt like doing, I guess. I wasn't really setting out to sound old, but it does sound old, and it sounds like something from the 70s. I think part of the reason it sounds like that is it's using hardware-based analog sequencing, which is a huge thing now in some circles. People are crazy about it, but it was basically non-existent for quite a while. It was what sequences, just to keep it simple here, a sequencer plays a sequence of notes. It can do more than that. And the old machines on or on any of these newer ones that are modular, analog modular synthesizers, it's really just sending out a sequence of voltages. Most typically you would hear it applied to frequencies, so you hear a sequence of notes playing, pitches playing. That's what you heard a lot of back when in the old days on the big Moog systems and Buchla systems. But they were always completely out of reach financially. You couldn't really afford, you had to get a sequencer, you usually had to buy a big old system, which was absolutely out of the question unless you were a major educational institution or rock star or something. There were some standalones that were also still pretty expensive. I certainly couldn't afford it back in those days. Then along came computer-based sequencing, and that was it. And then we all went into that. I certainly went headlong into computer-based sequencing, which is a completely different animal. And it's not just 8 steps or something. It's infinite. You can just do whatever you want. It's a very different thing. So that kind of took all of us who were involved in electronic music through that period. We all just kind of went with the technology. What happens with this is a real common pattern in other areas as well, but in music technology, in electronic music, we always want the thing that we can't quite do. Oh, if only we had this thing, or if only it could do this, or if only it could do that. And eventually manufacturers start to give us that, but as it keeps giving us things that we want, it tends to drop a few things that people aren't so excited about anymore. And once enough time goes by, we keep getting all these new things, and we're losing this little bit of stuff that we're losing starts to really add up. And that certainly has happened in synthesizers. And to the point now, of course, it's really been for years, people have lusted after and wanted things like this vintage Mini Moog, and I have actually a vintage modular Moog as well, highly, highly prized. And because they have a particular sound that's basically lost. I mean, now there's all kinds of virtual computer-based versions and so on. It's really not the same thing. So I went down that route, and I was certainly pulled into everything into the one box in the computer, because it just makes so much sense. And you can save everything. You can come back to it a month later and pick up where you left off, and you don't have to reset anything up. It's logical, and it's extremely deep and flexible, and there's a lot of reasons why it's all gone that way. But as we've all gone that way, and I still work on the computer, me and a lot of people started to long for these old machines because they had a particular kind of sound. Also because it's such a different way of working than what we do now. You can't save anything on these modulars. You make a patch, you might come back in 10 minutes and bump the cables and it'll be different. I mean, it's very temperamental. It's hard to get the same thing twice. You really can't get the exact same thing twice ever. And it's very ephemeral. So there's something kind of interesting about that. I kind of like that. And there's no presets. So whenever you're going to make a sound, you got to build it from scratch. And I just find that really attractive. So I've kind of gotten what's happened along the way here in recent years, not long ago. There has been a huge explosion of new analog synthesizer components. A bunch of companies. There's like over 200 now, I think, making modules. I mean, they don't all make everything, but some of them just make a few modules. Some of them make every kind of module you could think of. And it's real exciting. So I'm very stimulated and having a lot of fun because I got my little Moog modular, beautiful gem, but now I've been able to add in all kinds of new modules from different manufacturers, and I can expand my capabilities. Just having a blast. But one thing, this is kind of a, sorry I had to give you all that background, but what's interesting is as I started to acquire some of these new modules, one of the first things I got into was I bought an actual hardware sequencer, the 8-step sequencer. And I was thinking, oh my, how quaint, 8 steps. I was used to infinite steps on the computer. But I thought, oh, this will be kind of fun. It's not that expensive. And you get a little expander for it. And then you start to get other things that go with it. And pretty soon you realize it is so different than the computer-based thing. There are really severe limits. But in its own way, it's sort of becomes infinite. Also because of the ways you can introduce random voltage into the whole process of generating stuff on this hardware. It's a really different way to work, and it just drew me in. And I started to do things like this piece. Actually, this is the first actual piece that I've done using this technology where I did repeating patterns like loops. I just never did that kind of thing. I mean, all this time in the computer, all these years, I mean, I just never liked looping. I thought that was kind of, I don't know, I thought it was kind of lazy. I thought things were better if you didn't copy and paste. I did it once in a while a little, but mostly I avoided it. Really, when I was studying composition at the university too, we were always encouraged to avoid repeat signs. That was better just write it out because you start to put in little variation, little things that made it richer. And I generally agree with that. So I've always sort of steered away from loops. Well, getting into this hardware sequencing, loops. I mean, it just says here's a loop, and it sort of pushes you that way. You can make it do random stuff, which is what the first things I did with it. Set it to you set a pitch set, create a pitch set, and just have it go random, so it randomly triggers them. That's really, really fun. And that's another thing that this technology lends itself to is chance operations through the implementation of random voltage. I'll try not to get too deep into the weeds here. There's some of the random voltage stuff in this piece, but there's more of the repeating pattern idea. Lots of repeating patterns that are always evolving and changing. And I can certainly see, as I hear the piece now, I can really hear the influence of minimalism in that from my background. Though I was never really way into minimalism, I was certainly influenced by it, and I certainly love a lot of minimalism that I've listened to. And also you hear that stuff from the 70s, the sort of German Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream, where they do these patterns. They were actually being influenced by minimalism themselves, but they had these sequencers, these step sequencers, and it was easy for them to do these patterns. And it's evocative of that to me. When I listen to it now, I go, oh my, I can hear that influence. It wasn't really what I was setting out to do, but it's really the technology is kind of drawing me to explore this. So I'm having a lot of fun with it. So that's new ground for me, really, repeating patterns like this. And I really like how it all came out. Now, this piece, like all of my pieces in recent years, is made using a fragment-based composition method where I generate all kinds of musical elements, I record them into the computer, and then I construct my finished work in the computer. So the same is true of this piece. I recorded a lot of material into the computer and then constructed the piece in the computer. And then I'd come back, maybe generate some more material, and I kind of went back and forth a little bit. But the idea is generate elements that you want to work with and then construct the piece in the computer. It starts out, just to give you a little blow-by-blow on the piece, it starts out with a lot of real sort of sustained, real smooth, sustained sort of layers of sound happening. And that eventually gives way to some, you start to gradually start to hear coming out of that really, really, really quick material. And this is an example of random voltage being applied to pitch. It's totally random pitches on a real set clock, so the tempo stays exact the way I want it. But it's just this random. So this, to me, that it all sort of sounds static. and stationary in a way. But what happens is all that random voltage, random pitch sequence stuff that's really quick, gradually at the same rate, you start to hear merging out of that an actual repeating pattern as they slowly, one gives way to the other. There's like multiple layers of patterns, and I'm sort of gradually cross-fading them. So you start to hear you start to perceive a pattern that's obviously repeating. And at that point, really from there to the end of the piece, it just starts to propel. You start to feel this real forward movement, this forward motion. That's why I've named it implied motion. It sort of feels like it's implying motion. So you get a repeating pattern starting to go, and about the time you're going, well, okay, this is a repeating pattern, depending on how much attention you're paying, you'll start to notice it's also changing. It's also the material within that pattern is gradually transforming and shifting. Then there'll be a big point of arrival that happens, and then you get a really big obvious 8-note pattern that's repeating. Really at this point you're hearing there's another layer that's going on that's essentially a mini-moog solo that's happening over that, just cutting through. And but really from here to the end you're going to get patterns that just evolve and change. The lengths change, the filters change, they're evolving, gradually shifting. And you'll have, once in a while, you'll have the reintroduction of sustained material with that, including some that's little gestures that are performed on the Moog, the old Moog System 12 here, where I'm playing it through a device called a talk box, which is, it's literally it's like a metal box. It's a guitar effect pedal, but it's basically a metal box with a speaker in it. You play this, the sound goes in there, audio signal, and the speaker actually plays the sound up through an actual physical plastic tube that you stick in your mouth, and you have a microphone up to your mouth, and then you just shape the sound with your mouth, not using your vocal cords. Just you shape it with your mouth, and it just rattles your fillings loose. But it's a really neat way to shape sounds. I'm not using it to actually speak words. It's anything. It's just I'm using it just to shape. Everybody knows this device, or many of you will know this device from the made famous by Peter Frampton with the Frampton Comes Alive. Do you feel like I feel? He's making it sound like do you feel like I feel? I don't do that. But I do really like that I can shape sound with my mouth by using this device. So you'll hear some things like these slow things that are shaping in a way. You might be able to actually pick up that some of that is like mouth shaping. So that's some of what I could tell you here about Implied Movement, this electronic piece. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me talk about it, and I hope you get to hear the actual full piece one of these days. Buy the record!